Hey guys, if you enjoy the content of my videos, you can like, subscribe, hit the notification bell to get notices of my uploads of all my videos, and also comment down below. Welcome. This is the Day Show, and I am Day Summers.
Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI ran a counterintelligence program named COINTELPRO that was initiated by J. Edgar Hoover. COINTELPRO mainly targeted civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King, and it's commonly understood that this was an abuse of its surveillance power in a manner to suppress a peaceful movement. So I would like to ask Mr. Chair unanimous consent to enter this report into the record, which is Black Identity Extremists Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers. I believe earlier you said you were not familiar with the report. Is that correct?
Well, I haven't read it. I know some of the alleged targeting of officers by
Okay, so I would
group.
like to know, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. So you are somewhat familiar with it. Who had the power in your department to order a report like this?
I'm not sure how that report got ordered. I don't believe I explicitly approved it or directed it.
Okay, so you haven't necessarily read the report, but you are familiar with the term Black Identity Extremists?
Well, I think so, yes.
So can you tell me what that term means to you? Do you believe that there is a movement of African Americans that identify themselves as Black Identity Extremists, and what does that movement do?
Well, it'd be interesting to see the conclusions of that report, but I'm aware that there are groups that do have an extraordinary commitment to their racial identity, and some have transformed themselves even into violent activists.
Are you aware of white organizations that do this as well? Given that white supremacy is well-documented, well-researched movements such as the neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, etc., are they white identity extremists?
I didn't follow that question, please, again.
Is there a term or a report on white identity extremists? You mentioned you were familiar with Black people who identify with their racial identity.
Yes, but it's not coming to me at this moment.
Not coming to you?
It's
certainly a group such as the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, and then the skinhead movements, but there's a racial identity white movements that have been identified for sure.
So has the FBI done a report on white identity extremists that are likely motivated to target law enforcement officers? Is there such
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, are you aware of a group called the Sovereign Citizens?
I've heard that group, yes.
And I believe that the Sovereign Citizens is primarily a white organization that absolutely has targeted police officers and killed police officers. You're not aware of that?
I'm not aware of all their crimes, but I know they're a group that's known to have violent tendencies.
Could you name an African-American organization that have committed violent acts against police officers? Could you name one today? In this report, they name organizations from 30, 40 years ago, but can you name of one today that has targeted police officers in a violent manner?
I believe I could, but I would want to be, to confirm that and submit it to you in writing. But I believe we had, within the last year or so, 4 police officers killed by a group that some have described as extremists.
So what has happened is that there have been a couple of incidents in which African Americans did kill police officers who were not associated with a Black organization. And so one, for example, in Baton Rouge was associated with Sovereign Citizens, which is primarily a white group. So you should know that there's a lot of concern in the community, especially from organizations such as Black Lives Matter. By the way, would you consider Black Lives Matter a Black identity extremist group?
I'm not able to comment on that. I have not so declared it.
So you should know that a lot of activists around the country are very concerned that we're getting ready to repeat a very sad chapter of our history, where people who are rightfully protesting what they consider to be an injustice in their community, which is their relationship with police officers, are now being targeted and labeled as extremists and are going through periods of surveillance and harassment. And so I would like to know, what is your department going to do to protect the rights of average citizens to protest if they have a concern about police officers.
This department will not unlawfully target people.
So if that's the case, then I would ask that you review this report, Black Identity Extremists Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers, because I personally don't believe that any such organizations exist. The organizations that are referred to in this report are organizations from decades ago. And so I would like to know, what will you do to essentially roll back what is listed in this report? Because it's not accurate. Sir?
We will look at the report. I actually would be interested in reading it. But they usually do an excellent job, objective and fair, on those kind of reports.
Okay, well, just...
Time of the gentlewoman has expired.
Senator Durbin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wray, welcome. I'd like to ask you a question. Do you know what group was responsible for more homicides from 2000 to 2016 more than any other domestic extremist group?
Not sure, but I trust you're about to tell me.
Not a trick question. I raised that question because your testimony that was submitted to the committee talked a lot about homegrown violent extremists. In an unclassified FBI DHS Joint Intelligence Bulletin in May 2017 found that white supremacist extremism poses a persistent threat of lethal violence. Went on to say that white supremacists were responsible for more homicides from 2000 to 2016 than any other domestic extremist movement. 7 members of the committee joined me in writing a letter to you and Attorney General Barr explaining our concern about whether the FBI and Department of Justice were taking adequate measures to combat white supremacist violence and minimizing this growing domestic terrorism threat. The term white supremacist, white nationalist is not included in your statement to the committee when you talk about threats to America. There is a reference to racism, which I think probably was meant to include that, but nothing more specific. We live in a world where the neo-Nazis and white supremacists are taking lives in many places. A white supremacist murdered 51 Muslim worshippers in New Zealand. 2017, a white supremacist murdered 6 Muslim worshippers at a mosque in Quebec City, Canada. And in the United States, far-right extremists perpetrated the shootings at the Sikh Temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the Shabbat of Poway, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Poway? Synagogue in Poway, California. The reason I raise this is because there is a concern that this is not being taken as seriously as it should be, as one of the real threats in our country. And a concern as well that the FBI has now changed its definition when it comes to race-related crimes. They've created a new category for what you term racially motivated violent extremism. It used to be white supremacist incidents. Could you explain to me why there was this change, whether you consider this a serious threat, and what you're doing about it? I ask you this in the context of a national conversation that's taking place every single day under this presidency about the issue of race and incitements to emotion and violence by the people who are using race as the motivator.
So, Senator, first, let me sort of unpack your question a little bit. Needless to say, we take domestic terrorism or hate crime, regardless of ideology, extremely seriously, I can assure you. And we are aggressively pursuing it, using both counterterrorism resources and criminal investigative resources, and partnering closely with our state and local partners. In just the last little while, we've had cases involving, for example, the Coast Guard lieutenant who was planning an attack on elected officials and TV anchors here in this area. We've had militia members.
Was that motivated by a white supremacy belief?
I think it would be a version of that, certainly. Our focus, when you asked about the categorization, our focus is on the violence. We, the FBI, don't investigate ideology no matter how repugnant. we investigate violence. And any extremist ideology, when it turns to violence, we're all over it. And we've had, in fact, and that you don't have to just take my word for it, just in the first 3 quarters of this year, we've had more domestic terrorism arrests than the prior year, and it's about the same number of arrests as we have on the international terrorism side.
I ask you to clarify that, because when you talk, I don't know if we're talking about the same thing, but when you talk about homegrown violent extremists, and I talk about domestic violent extremists, are we talking about the same thing?
No. So we use the term homegrown violent extremism to refer to people already here in the United States who are inspired by different parts of the global jihadist movement to commit terrorist acts.
Okay,
we
I
use
get
the
that.
term domestic terrorism to refer to a broader array of threats ranging from anarchist extremism to different kinds of racially motivated violent extremism to different kinds of environmental extremism, et cetera.
So let me pursue that for a second. So the point I'm getting to, and the reason I quoted this unclassified report, is if it's violence that motivates the FBI investigation. What we have here is a statement in this unclassified joint intelligence report that between the years 2000 and 2016, the white supremacists were responsible for more homicides than any other domestic extremism movement. Now, I see the distinction you're making, homegrown versus domestic. But let me ask you, can you quantify either one of them for us?
Well, in terms of number of arrests, we have, through the third quarter of this fiscal year, had about, give or take, 100 arrests in the international terrorism side, which includes the homegrown violent extremism.
This year?
This year. But we've also had just about the same number, again, don't quote me to the exact digit, on the domestic terrorism side. And I will say that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it includes other things as well.
I think this is significant. I do not want to diminish the work that you're doing when it comes to the homegrown domestic terrorism in any way whatsoever. Not at all. And I understand that as a serious threat to the United States, and 9/11 is proof positive of that fact. But what you have just said is significant. If the number of people arrested this calendar year, when it comes to this extremist conduct, is about equal between those who were inspired by foreign actors, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever it might be, and those who were inspired by white supremacy or at least some version of race. Now, if that's the way I heard you say it, please clarify.
So let me clarify. What I just gave you were the number of arrests. The number of arrests. That's not necessarily the same thing as the number of investigations.
Well, let's
right? So that's an important distinction.
Assuming the integrity of your department, which I will, the fact that they would make an arrest, it is with the belief that a crime has been committed. The point I'm getting to is we are in a very tense moment in American history on the issue of race. We are having a national conversation that we haven't had in a long time about racism and the reaction, what's acceptable and what is not. And what I'm asking you from the FBI point of view, and what you've told me, is that we ought to take care, as seriously as we take foreign-inspired terrorism, there is a domestic terrorism underway in the name of race that is as threatening in some respects as the foreign terrorism. That's the way I hear it.
Yeah, I don't know that I think the greatest terrorist threat to the homeland is the homegrown violent extremist. I will say that we take domestic,
foreign-inspired,
which is jihadist-inspired violence. That does not mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that we don't take domestic terrorism, including hate crime committed on behalf of some kind of white supremacist ideology, extremely seriously. And we have had a number of very significant arrests. I mentioned the Coast Guard one, but we had militia members in Cleveland stockpiling explosives to build pipe bombs. We had the Cesar Sayoc case involving the package IED. We had the Rise Above movement, where we arrested 8 different people on federal rioting charges. One of them fled to El Salvador, and we got him back. We had the Tree of Life synagogue shooting case, which you mentioned, and the shooting outside San Diego, the attack in the synagogue there. We got 29 count, I think it was, conviction and life sentence related to the Charlottesville matter. So make no mistake, the FBI, working with our state and local law enforcement partners, is all over this.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to get right into this topic of the Chris Wray hearing and how it affects the Black Extremists Report that they had out on African Americans. His hearing, the second part of the clip was his hearing, and you saw, it was a video clip of his hearing, and it was on today, Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019. I just want to say again that these are all my thoughts, my expressions, opinions. Nothing that I say is factual. My commentary is all opinions and what I feel. And I like for other people to express what they feel and think down in the comments below, just to let me know what you think. Anyway, I'm going to go into the story. Like I've said, a lot of it relates to things that they are passing within legislative acts and laws, and they're able to pass powers to do things that for really no real reason. Now, earlier, I think a couple of years ago, they found out that they had this thing called the Black Extremists Report that was circulating, and a lot of people found out about it. The ACLU, all these different groups found out about it. And it was something that was a surprise, because we didn't know why they would do such a thing like that and what was the basis of it. Now we're starting to see that for some reason, because when they were first asked back in 2016, the Sessions, Jeff Sessions, he didn't know why it was there, but he didn't want to even think about getting rid of it. And then a few years later, we see Chris Wray on the hot seat, and he says, well, the majority of the crimes were being conducted by non-black people who were not black. That's how he put it, people who are not black. He didn't say color, not colored, but people who were non-black. And that gave us a big leeway today as to why on earth is this bill still in power? Why is this bill still effective? And I just think that these are things that we need to know about. I think these are things that we need to be concerned about, because if you look at how the political climate is today, who are they trying the most to get out there to riot and fight and act crazy? And we are the only ones who are not doing these things. It's these other groups of people that are doing these things, and they are basically getting away with it. They're not going to jail. They're giving Trump the worst time. They seem to have more power than him, or as much as him, almost. And African Americans are sitting there like, we're the only ones that are being really effectively persecuted. I mean, you see the things where there's been police shootings of black people. We're told we're not able to gather together and talk about being prideful of ourselves, because then we're called racist and segregist and all these different things if we want to be proud to be black or buy black or do any, and we ourselves are doing that to ourselves. So I mean, I don't understand, and I don't understand why our community is the way that it is, that we're still on these Jim Crow games. We're still loving the game, and the game was Jim Crow games, plantation games, where they had people sitting and dividing each other and telling on each other and selling out on each other and all these different things. And now that we're starting to have a little bit of awakeness, or getting on code, or whatever you want to call it, we're being, all of a sudden there's these laws being made that shouldn't even be made when we're not the ones who are causing the problem. What do you guys think? Do you think that this is something that has always happened, and will these other groups, will they still keep succeeding here off of us and off of our pain, and will we still keep allowing them? Why aren't we more together? Why aren't we more unified? Why don't we want to help each other? Why do we keep following the game? Why are we still segregated like this and not smart enough to get up and do our own thing? These guys are smart. They're coming from another country, and they're putting their people up in legal offices that they can trust. Everyone is so afraid to trust everyone else, of which we can't. But if you use common sense, stop sabotaging each other, because the very person you sabotage is the person that's going to help us get ahead. You know, it's just really sad. What do you guys think of the situation? Do you think that is justification of what Black people have been saying, or do you think it's just the same old, same old? You can leave your comments down below, and if you want to like, subscribe, follow on any of my platforms, you're welcome to. And thanks guys for listening.